"You've been living in my house rent-free for 3 years," my son-in-law said, smiling like he was making a joke. "The least you could do is stay out of our way on holidays." He said it at the Thanksgiving table, in front of my daughter, in front of their 2 kids, in front of my daughter's in-laws, who I had just met 40 minutes earlier. I sat there with a fork in my hand and didn't say a word. That was November. By February, I had made a phone call that changed everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name isn't important. What matters is that I'm 68 years old. I worked 31 years as a civil engineer. I raised my daughter alone after her mother passed when she was 14. And I have never, not once in my life, asked anyone for anything I didn't earn. When my wife died, it was just the 2 of us. My daughter Renee was in 8th grade. She was angry for a long time at me, at the world, at everything. I understood it. I let her be angry. I just kept showing up. I drove her to school. I packed her lunches badly. She told me years later that my sandwiches were always a little soggy, but I packed them every morning. I went to every school play, every volleyball game, every single parent-teacher conference where I was very clearly the only father who didn't know what he was supposed to say. We were close. At least, I thought we were. She married Dex 8 years ago. He was charming when I first met him. The kind of man who shook your hand firmly and called you sir and seemed to mean it. He had opinions about wine and restaurants and the right neighborhoods to live in, and Renee seemed happy. So I kept my thoughts to myself. They bought a house in Phoenix. I was still in Sacramento, still in the house where Renee grew up. Then 3 years ago, my knees started giving me real trouble. 2 surgeries in 14 months. I wasn't helpless, but I wasn't moving around the way I used to, and the house felt large and the stairs felt steep. And my doctor suggested, carefully, the way doctors suggest things they know you won't like, that I might want to consider a living arrangement where I wasn't alone. Renee called me the same week. She said she and Dex had talked, and they had a guest room, and they wanted me to come stay with them while I recovered, and figured out next steps. She said, "Dad, we want you here. The kids want to know their grandfather." I believed her. I gave up my lease. I put most of my furniture in storage. I packed what I needed into my car and drove to Phoenix. The first few months were fine. I watched the grandkids in the afternoons. Gracie, who was 6, and her brother Wes, who was 4. I made dinner 3 or 4 nights a week. I fixed things around the house. I paid a fair portion of the utilities without being asked, because that's the kind of man I am. Dex worked from home. We were polite to each other. Renee was working long hours at a hospital administrator job she'd taken the year before. She was tired most of the time. We didn't talk as much as I'd expected. I noticed things, but I told myself I was imagining them. The way Dex would sigh when I walked into the kitchen while he was on a call, the way he referred to the guest room as your space, with a slight emphasis I couldn't quite interpret, the way weekend plans would get made, a day trip, a dinner with friends, and I would find out about them after the fact, when I heard the garage door and realized the house was suddenly quiet. I told myself, you are a guest in someone else's home. Adjust. So I did. I ate breakfast early, before anyone was up. I tried to stay out of the common areas during Dex's work hours. When Renee came home exhausted, I didn't burden her with small complaints. I read. I went for slow walks around the neighborhood. I video called my old friends back in Sacramento and didn't mention that I sometimes felt like I was living in a house where I was being quietly tolerated. My retirement savings were comfortable but not unlimited. I was living carefully. I wasn't spending on anything I didn't need. But I was there, and I wasn't contributing nothing. I was watching those grandchildren 4 afternoons a week, which meant Renee and Dex weren't paying for after-school care, which in Phoenix runs about $1,800 a month. I didn't say that. I thought it, but I didn't say it. The Thanksgiving comment was the first time anything was said out loud. After he said it, the least you could do is stay out of our way on holidays. The table went quiet. Renee stared at her plate. His parents looked at the centerpiece. Gracie asked if she could have more rolls. Wes had already fallen asleep in his chair. I set down my fork. I said, "You're right, Dex. I'll remember that." He seemed surprised I didn't argue. He laughed a little, like it had been a joke after all, and reached for his wine. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in that guest room, my space, and stared at the ceiling and thought about my wife, which I try not to do too often because it still hurts in the particular way that doesn't get better, only quieter. I thought about what she would have made of all this. She had a way of seeing through people very quickly, and she was never shy about it. She would have had Dex figured out in about 20 minutes, and she would have told me so in the car on the way home from the first dinner. I missed her terribly that night. I also made a decision. Not immediately. I want to be honest about the timeline. I didn't wake up the next morning and take action. I spent December watching. I paid attention in a way I hadn't let myself before. Not suspicious, exactly, just clear-eyed. I noticed that Renee and I almost never had a conversation alone. When I came to find her in the kitchen or knocked on the office door she sometimes worked in on weekends, there was always a reason to keep it short. She was tired. She was about to get on a call. She'd talk to me later. Later kept not coming. I noticed that the invitations to family activities had mostly stopped. Christmas plans were announced rather than discussed. I was told the week before that we would be spending Christmas Eve at Dex's parents' house, and that Christmas morning would be just us four. His words passed through Renee because they wanted a quiet family morning with the kids. I was 68 years old, and I was being managed like a scheduling problem. Renee's birthday was in January. I had been saving for a few months to take her somewhere nice, just the two of us, like we used to when she was in her 20s before Dex. I found a restaurant downtown that had good reviews. I asked her on a Tuesday morning if she'd like to go. She said she'd have to check with Dex about the schedule. I nodded and went back to my room. She never brought it up again. That was when I understood that the woman I was trying to reach was not quite accessible to me anymore. I don't blame her entirely. I've had enough time to think about it. I think she loved me, and also found it easier not to fight for the space it would take, not to push against whatever Dex had built around the edges of our relationship. It's a particular kind of loss, watching someone you love choose the path of least resistance. It's quieter than the loud kinds of loss. It sits differently in your chest. I started making calls in February. The first call was to my old friend Bart. We'd worked together for 20 years, and he'd retired to a small place in Tucson. He'd mentioned more than once that the house next door was for rent from a woman who preferred long-term tenants she could trust. I asked him if it was still available. It was. The second call was to my financial advisor to talk through what it would look like to draw a consistent monthly amount while keeping the rest of my savings stable. We'd had this conversation before, but I needed to hear the numbers again. The third call was to a property management company in Sacramento because I still had some things in storage that needed to be dealt with, and I needed to understand my options. I made these calls from the backyard in the early morning before anyone else was awake. I sat in one of the patio chairs with my coffee and I talked in a low voice, and I felt, for the first time in months, like I was in charge of something. I told no one. Renee's birthday came. January had already passed, but I'd kept the restaurant in mind. I took myself there for lunch on a Tuesday and had an excellent meal and left a generous tip and drove home feeling more like myself than I had in a long time. I signed the lease in Tucson on a Thursday. The following Saturday, I asked Renee if we could talk. I waited until Dex had taken the kids to a soccer thing. It was the first time in weeks we were in the same room without anyone else. She looked nervous when I sat down at the kitchen table. I think she thought I was going to say something that would require her to make a choice. I said, "I've rented a place in Tucson. I'll be moving out in 2 weeks." She blinked. She said, "What? Dad, where is this coming from?" I said, "It's been coming for a while, Renee." She started to cry a little. Not dramatically, just the kind of quiet tears that surprise you. She said she didn't want me to leave. She said things had been hard lately. She said she knew it hadn't been easy. I wanted to ask her, why didn't you say any of this when it might have changed something? But I didn't. I just said, "I love you. I'll be an hour and a half away. I'm not disappearing." She asked about the grandkids. I said I'd still be there for them. I said they could visit in Tucson. I said Gracie would probably love the pool in the complex where I was renting. Then I said, carefully, I'm not going to disappear, but I'm also not going to live somewhere I've been told to stay out of the way. She looked at the table for a long time. She said, he said that. It wasn't a question. I said, at Thanksgiving. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, I'm sorry, Dad. I believed her. I think she was. But an apology for something that happened 4 months ago, offered only when the consequence arrives, that's a particular kind of apology. It tells you about the order of things. Dex came home while I was packing some boxes in my room. He stood in the doorway and watched me fold a sweater for a moment. Then he said, Renee told me you're leaving. I said, that's right. He said, you don't have to do that. I said, I know. He stood there a little longer. The thing about men like Dex is that they are very comfortable when you are accommodating them and very uncertain when you are not. He didn't know what to do with a version of events where I was simply leaving without asking him for anything. He said, we can talk about this. I said, we're talking about it right now. He said some other things. He said Renee would be upset. He said it wasn't good for the kids to have disruptions. He said the room was mine for as long as I needed it. Each sentence was a slightly different angle on the same thing. He wanted me to stay in a position where he held the terms. I kept folding clothes. Eventually he left. I moved out on a Friday morning. Renee helped me carry things to the car. She was quiet. The kids were at school. I hugged her in the driveway for a long time and she held on hard, the way she used to when she was small. I said, I'll call you Sunday. She said, okay. She was crying again when I pulled away. I watched her in the rearview mirror until I turned the corner. The drive to Tucson is about 2 hours. I put on a radio station that played old stuff, the kind of music my wife used to call your gas station music because I always sought it out on long drives. I had the windows down. It was a cool morning and the desert looked clean and spare and honest. By the time I crossed into Tucson, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happy, exactly. Something quieter than that. More like myself. Bart came over that first afternoon to help me unload the heavier boxes. He brought his wife, Connie, who had made a pot of soup and left it on my new stove with a note that said, "Welcome to the neighborhood, neighbor." She put a little drawing of a house at the bottom, which made me smile more than I expected. That evening I sat on my small patio. It's not fancy, just a square of concrete with a view of the parking lot and a sliver of mountains in the distance. And I ate soup and drank half a beer and called my daughter. She answered on the second ring. We talked for 40 minutes. About the kids, about a show she'd been watching, about nothing important and also about everything important in the way that conversations can be when you have enough time and space to just talk. Before she hung up, she said, "Dad, I should have said something to him." I said, "Probably." She said, "I'm going to." I said, "Okay." I didn't ask what she was going to say. I didn't need to manage the outcome. That was between her and Dex, and I had spent enough years trying to make sure the people around me were comfortable. 3 weeks later, Renee called on a Sunday morning. She told me that she and Dex had had a long conversation. She said some things had been said that needed to be said. She didn't give me details, and I didn't press for them. She said, "He wants to apologize to you. In person, if you're willing." I said I'd think about it. I have been thinking about it. What I know is this. I am 68 years old, and I wake up every morning in a place that is mine. I make my coffee at whatever hour I choose. I sit on my square of concrete and look at the sliver of mountains, and I don't feel like a scheduling problem. My granddaughter called me last week to ask if she could come visit for a long weekend. She said she wanted to see the pool. I said, "Yes, of course, come whenever you want." Her voice on the phone was bright and uncomplicated, the way children's voices are when they love you without conditions. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting older. Everyone talks about the indignities, the knees, the condescension, the ways the world stops accounting for you. And those things are real. But what they don't mention is that at a certain point, you know yourself well enough to know what you'll accept. I raised my daughter alone. I went to every volleyball game. I packed the soggy sandwiches. I am not a guest in my own life. And the morning I drove away from that driveway in Phoenix, with the windows down and the desert opening up ahead of me, was the first morning in a long time that I actually believed it.